Hey, it's Terrell from goHUNT. I'm down here in Las Vegas. We're up here at our local archery range. We thought it would be good this time of year to do a video on how to sight your individual pin or pins in, and then how to build a sight tape. So I'm going to take you through the whole process of how I sight my individual pins in, and then how I use a program like Archer's Advantage and then some other measurements to actually build the most accurate sight tape you can get. So the first step is to put a horizontal line of tape or some sort of marker that you can see. You're not necessarily worried at this point about the left and right, but I'm mostly worried about the vertical. So I want to make sure that each individual pin is exactly dead nut sighted in as I go back. So like I said, I've got some red athletic tape here. I'm just going to take a piece of it and I'm going to lay it on a blank target like I've got here, which is just a blank piece of cardboard. I'm just going to run a line. As I get back into farther range, you know, if I want to sight my 60-yard pin, I might double these up just so it's a little bit easier to see. So I got the piece of tape on this blank surface here. The reason I like a horizontal piece of tape is that I can line up each individual pin as those are coming out from your housing horizontally. I can line that up with the length of each tape. And as I go down and sight in each individual pin, it's going to give me a great reference vertically. So I'm trying to just get each pin as accurate as I possibly can as I go in and I sight my bow in. A couple of tips when you start to sight your individual pins in. You want to do it on a relatively flat surface. You also want to do it, if you can, on a day that it's not real windy, so not a ton of movement. I like to shoot groups, so I might shoot 4 or 5 arrows per pin, make adjustments, resight those in, shoot them again, and I just want to make sure I get the best point or pin location for each one as I go. That's going to allow me to build the best sight tape that I can once I start plugging that information into a program like Archer's Advantage. So non-windy day is great. The other thing I would say is you always want to use your rangefinder. So everybody's rangefinder, it could vary a little bit, and it doesn't necessarily matter that much, just as long as your pins and your bow is sighted in with your rangefinder, because that's what you're going to use when you're in the field. You're aiming at a buck or a bull, you get that range, you want that pin to be dead nuts. So don't rely so much on the markers if you're at your local range. Always verify it with your rangefinder, sight your pins in with your rangefinder. So I've got that on the bail. I'm just going to step back at 20 and start shooting a group of arrows and just going to walk that individual pin in as I go. All right, so I just shot a group at 20. You can see I'm running a little bit hot. And when you're sighting in your sight, so if you're high, you want to move your sight up. If you're low, you want to move your sight down. So you essentially just chase your arrow. I'm not really worried about left and right at this point. I'm really only worried about my vertical. So I'm trying to hit this line. So I'm going to step back to 20, shoot another group. I'll make adjustment to my sight. So I would move that ever so slightly up until I shoot groups. I'm going to walk these arrows into the very middle of that tape. I'm going to do that for every pin. So I'm going to do 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60 the exact same way, shooting groups until I walk each individual pin, and I know for a fact that each one is sighted in on the vertical. One note I would add to you, if you shoot a multi-pin sight, this is kind of personal preference, but for me, I like to put my middle pin kind of in the middle of the housing. I feel like that gives me the best alignment for my peep and the outer ring of my sight. For me, that's the best reference. In saying that, if you're shooting a 3-pin sight, you might lose the ability to get out to some extended yardages. So you may make an adjustment if you're shooting like a 3-pin sight. In that case, you may want to walk those pins further down in your housing, which is going to give you the ability to get more range out of your bow. So you might be able to get that 110, 120 yards if you want to do some practice, or if you're shooting like a tack event and they've got some of those targets that are really extended ranges. So as you can see, I've got a pretty decent group. I'm just going to make the adjustment, shoot another group. I'm going to walk each individual pin in, moving each pin within my housing until I get those arrows hitting that exact line. All right, so shot a couple groups at 20, walked my pin up. you want to pay particular attention. So when a shot breaks clean, the pin's right where you want it to be, and it hits middle, you want to pay attention to those, because those are the shots, you know, that count. You know that they felt good and the pin was right where it needed to be. You can see I had a pretty decent little group on the line here at 20. So when you're doing this, you want to start with a blank sight tape. So just a piece of arrow wrap or anything that you can stick to your sight. And as I do that, you know, I've got my 20-yard pin set. I'm just going to make a mark on my indicator on that blank sight tape. And then as I move back, I'm going to make marks on my sight tapes as I go. I'm going to use that within Archer's Advantage or to compare and verify with the sight tapes that come with your sight so that you can get the best sight tape for your setup. So I've got my 20-yard pretty well set. I'm going to move back and do the same thing for 30, 40, 50, and 60. All right, so I'm back here at 60 yards. I've gone through the process of shooting groups and shooting individual pins in at 20, 30, 40, and 50 yards. And now I'm back to 60. You want to make sure that your 60-yard pin is dead nut set. You want to make it as accurate as possible, as well as that first pin, the 20-yard pin, because that distance is going to come into account when you plug that information into Archer's Advantage to generate a sight tape. So you want to make sure that those two are definitely accurate and set. So I'm going to take some time. It might take you a day or two to sight your pins in. I would say don't rush it. Shoot groups. Make sure that your arrows are very accurate. You know, everything comes down to your individual pin. You want to make sure that those pins are set. So I'm just going to take some time. I'm going to shoot groups at 60 yards and make sure that that pin is absolutely where it needs to be. All right, so I'm back here at my truck. I spent some time shooting groups at each individual yardage. I moved my pins inside my housing, and I've got my 20, 30, my 40, 50, and 60-yard pins set perfectly so that those arrows are hitting on the line as I shoot those. Like I said, I wasn't necessarily worried about the left to right. I'm mostly worried about getting my pins set the exact position as I go so that they're sighted in on the vertical. You can work out those left and right misses same way you do this process. You know, you can shoot arrows going back to 60, making those adjustments. And again, you just chase your arrows. So if you're missing right, you're gonna move your sight right. If you're missing up, you're gonna move your sight up. Same thing, down, move your sight down. It's a pretty simple process. The better you can be during this process, the more accurate, the better your sight tape's gonna be. I feel like my marks are pretty good right now, so we're going to run back to the office. We're going to plug all this information into Archer's Advantage, along with some more information that I'm going to touch on when I get back, but we'll generate a really nice, accurate sight tape. I'm getting ready for TAC coming up here in a week and a half or so, so I'll have a real good, solid tape set for that. All right, so I've been up to the range and I sighted in my pins. So I've got the 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60-yard pins sighted in. Next step is to develop or get a sight tape for your sight so that you can, you know, sight in those extra yardages, 70, 80, 90, even 100, using your bottom pin as a floater. Same process if you're shooting a single pin, like I said, you're going to sight your 20 and, you know, move that sight down with the slider, sight it in at 60, and record those distances on your blank sight tape. And then from that, you'll be able to get a sight tape. There are a few ways that you can get a sight tape. I'm going to go through two of them, which are more simplistic or simple, and then I'm going to go into like the more accurate, the more extensive version, which is to use a piece of software like Archer's Advantage. And I'm going to show you how you put those measurements in and how you get those measurements to generate a really accurate sight tape. So when you buy your sight, a new sight, they typically come with a bunch of sight tapes. So you can see this is a set of sight tapes off a B3 sight that I put on another bow here recently. And most sights come with these. You know, if you buy a black gold, each individual tape will actually have a feet per second mark on it. And you can shoot those through a chronographer and then line up the tape with the exact feet per second that you shot, and you can put that on. It'll be pretty close. It won't be as accurate as what you can generate with a piece of software like Archer's Advantage, but it'll be pretty dang close. But there is a couple ways that you can do this, and I'm just going to touch on those. These are, again, the more simplistic ways. My preference is to use a piece like a software like Archer's Advantage. So I'm going to run through a couple simple ways to get your sight tape and match up your pins to the sight tapes that come with your sight. So one of the simple ways that I've used in the past is just to take a piece of paper. So I've just trimmed a Post-it note down. And what I've done is just stuck that back in behind my pins. And I've got those pins sighted in 20 through 60. And then I'm just going to take a pen or a pencil and I'm just going to make a mark on each individual pin. And again, you got to kind of take some time, have a steady hand. But what I've done in the past, and this is just the most simple way, is just make a mark at each individual pin on this piece of paper. So after that, I can take this piece of paper out and I can line up the marks that I've made on my little Post-it note, and I can line those up with the 20 through 60 yard marks. And as I line those up, I can find the tape that came with my sight that matches most closely. And if you do that carefully, I mean, I ran through it really quickly, but if you do that carefully, you make precise marks with each individual pin on a piece of paper and line it up with the sight tape, you can generally get a sight tape that's pretty dang close to your setup. And that's worked, and that's like one of the most simple and easy ways. The next way is not that much more complex, but you can pick up a set of calipers. It's just a set of brass calipers that you can pick up at a Home Depot. I think it's about $9. This is very similar. All you're going to do is take that little caliper and you're going to measure the distance from the center of your top pin to the center of your bottom pin that you sighted in. And you're going to take that measurement, and then again, the same way you did with the piece of paper, you're just going to line that up with the sight tape that fits closest. So, you know, the 20 with the 60. And pretty quickly, as you scroll through here, you can find the sight tape that most closely matches your setup, which you sighted in at the range, 20 through 60. So if you shoot a single pin sight and you've been up to the range and you sighted in your single pin at 20 yards, and then you've sighted in a second distance, typically the further the better, because it's going to be that much more accurate. But for example, let's say I'm shooting a single pin sight and I've made a mark on my blank sight tape and that's sighted in at 20 yards. And then I've moved that single pin down with my slider. I'll mark my second mark, say that's 60 yards, say it's 80 yards, but you feel, you know, really confident with both those distances. What you would do is the exact same process. You would measure the distance with a set of calipers or even with a piece of paper between the two marks that you made on your sight tape. And then you're just going to take that distance and once again line it up with the marks that most closely align your marks that you shot in with your bow at the range. And through doing that with those calipers and the sight tapes that's provided with your sight, you're going to get a sight tape that's pretty dang accurate. The third way, which I'm going to dive into here, is to use a piece of software like Archer's Advantage to input all the different measurements. So you're going to take the measurement from the center of your peep to the pin, the center of your peep to your middle of your arrow at full draw, and you're going to put those in conjunction with your arrow weight and everything, and you're going to put that into the software, and you're going to generate a really accurate sight tape for your individual setup. All right, a couple measurements that you're going to have to take to input into Archer's Advantage to get the best tape for your setup is the distance from the center of your peep to the center of your arrow, and then also from the center of your peep to your pin. So I've got my bow in a last chance draw board here, which is a great accessory. I would highly recommend it. If you've got a bow press, you should also pick up a last chance draw board, because this comes in really handy for this kind of stuff or to check cam timing. If not, you can also have a buddy, if he's brave, get these same measurements for you. Come to full draw and you can have your buddy take these measurements and then input those into Archer's Advantage, which I'm going to show you how to do here in a second. But basically what you do, you've got your bow here at full draw, you have to have it at full draw, and you're going to measure the distance from the center of your peep to the center of your arrow. So just take your tape measure, and what I like to do is measure that distance from the bottom of my peep to the top of my arrow. And then I like to take my calipers here and I like to measure my peep. So I'm going to measure the width of my peep and divide that by 2, so I've got the distance to the exact center hole of my peep. I'm also going to do the exact same thing with my calipers, measure the width of my arrow, divide that by 2, and then I'm going to add those 3 measurements together. So essentially what you're going to have is a distance from the center hole of your peep to the center of your arrow at full draw. You're going to need that information to put it into Archer's Advantage. The next measurement that you're going to have to take is the distance from your pin. So you're going to measure from your pin, taking your tape measure to the center of your peep. And again, you can just use a tape measure, or like I said, you can take the calipers, you can measure the width of your peep, divide that by 2, and then the distance from the front of your peep here to your pin, and you can add those two together. But what you're going to want to have is you're going to have those two measurements. So once again, that's the distance from the center of your peep to your pin, and then also the center of your peep at full draw to the center of your arrow. Those are the two measurements that you're going to need to use in conjunction with the other measurements in Archer's Advantage. All right, so Archer's Advantage is a great program, and you can get their online software and account for about 12 bucks a year. It's pretty cheap, even if you just use it once. I use it all the time to pick out my arrows and work out spine and end weight to make sure that my arrows are the most consistent, and I can touch on that as I go through this. But basically what you do is you sign up for an account, you click on the online software. Once you log in, you can see that I'm logged in right here. At that point, I'm going to start a new setup, so I can select setup. So in this little section right here, I can put add setup, and I can add a setup description. So I'm going to put trails V3X33, and then I'm going to hit the OK button. At that point, I'm going to run down to my arrow configuration, and like I said, I like to play with this to kind of pick my arrows. This is going to put in the individual arrow weight. So I'm shooting a gold tip arrow. I can go down here and click on the individual arrow that I'm shooting, whether it's a kinetic pierce platinum. I can pick the spine, so I'm going to pick 300 spine, and then my arrow length. So your arrow length is not the throat of the nock to the end of the broadhead or whatever it is that you're shooting. It's the actual carbon to carbon, so that's just the raw shaft. So my shaft is 29 inches. I measured that just on a regular old tape measure, and then I'm going to take that and I'm going to put that right here in this box here. From that point, I can add my point details. So I'm shooting a 100 grain broadhead, and I'm shooting an Easton half out insert. So I'm just gonna go through this and put generic. You can find the individual inserts that the companies carry by clicking through that. Sometimes they don't have it. But for me, what I like to do is I actually like to weigh a insert. So I would take an insert, I would put it on my little last chance grain scale here and enter the weight of that insert. So that's a 55 grain titanium insert, which is what I've got on the end of my arrow. So I can go ahead and plug that in right here. The next is your nock detail. So you can add the nocks that you're shooting. Again, you can use generic here, or you can use the manufacturer. If you click on the drop down, you can click gold tip or whatever it is that you're shooting, and you can find the nock that you're shooting. If you're shooting an adapter, so like a collar that comes with these arrows, you can also add that. I'm just going to leave that as is right now. The next step would be go to your fletch. So you can click on the fletching option here, and you can find the manufacturer of your fletchings. You can click on the model. So I shoot a boning heat vane. It'll give you the length of the vane, and then all you need to do is enter the number of vanes that you're shooting. So I've got 4 vanes right now, and it'll automatically generate the weight per fletching, and it'll put it in this box. If you're not sure, again, you can use your little grain scale, and you can measure your individual vanes, and you can put the weight of those in that. And then finally, if you shoot an arrow wrap, you can put the weight of your arrow wrap in this box right here. So once you've got that all entered into the mix, next step, you can work down this line here with your sight configuration or your bow configuration. I'm going to jump over here to your bow configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the select bow from list, and as you click on that, you can select the manufacturer. I shoot a Matthews, so I've got a Matthews right here under the model. I'm going to click V3X33, which is the bow that I have. Limbs you don't need to worry about, cams you don't need to worry about, all that's already auto-filled. And the next thing you're going to do is just hit the transfer data to current setup button. So that's going to upload that bow into the system. At that point, I have the option when this screen pops up to enter the peak weight. So I know I'm shooting about 68 pounds, and I know that because I pulled it back with a scale. It's going to automatically generate the brace height. You can put in your AMO draw length, so that's just your draw length, which mine is 30 inches. This is all going to kind of auto-generate. It's going to give you an estimated arrow speed, and you can kind of play with that here in a second. Next step would be to enter the sight that you're using. As you put this in here, you can see that there's an inch option, or you can actually find the individual sights. You may have a spot hog hogfather, or a spot hog fast eddy, and you can find that site within this listing. If it's a site that is not included within this list, just click on the inch option. And then the next two measurements you would input would be those two measurements that we got on the bow press. So that's the distance from your peep, middle of your peep, all the way to your pins. So for me, as I did that, you guys saw it was 30 inches. And then the next measurement that you would input into this program is going to be peep height at full draw. And so that's going to be the distance from the center of your peep as you look through it to the center of your arrow. And again, you can get that measurement by putting it in a draw board, which is the easiest. Or, if you're brave and you got a buddy that you can trust, you can come to full draw and have him take that measurement for you. But the more accurate, the better. You want to put that in decimal points. Again, the better information you put into this program, the better your tape's going to be. So you put those two into that system. And at this point, the next step for me is I like to check the shaft selector. And as I click on that, it's going to give me kind of an overlay of my arrow and my setup. It's going to tell me, optimal spine right here, so I can see that this black line is right in the middle of the green, which is where I want it to be. As I look over here, I can see point weight, draw weight. So it'll give you like an estimated arrow weight, which is right over here. For me, what I like to do is I actually like to take an arrow, put it on a grain scale. I would say if you don't have one of these little grain scales from Last Chance Archery, it's a great investment, especially if you're tinkering with your own stuff. And I like to get an accurate measurement of what my arrow weighs. So I can see, this one is going to be about 458 grains. I mean, my estimated arrow weight here is 459, so it's pretty dang close. If you do have any variability in that, you can add weight to your setup in the setup category under arrow shaft. And you might add a few grains for glue that you use to glue your insert in. You might add a few grains for your glue that you glue your vanes on, but you can get the exact arrow weight for your setup and input that all within this program. You can also mess around with peak weight. So I can tell I might be a little underspine potentially with this setup, the way I'm looking at it. I can play with the arrow weight and the peak draw weight to kind of get that where I want it. So I might bump that draw weight down to 65 pounds and see what that does to my spine. But you can kind of see how that program works really nicely. The final step in generating your sight tape, you can come over here to customize. So you're going to click on that. At that point, you've got all the inputs, the way your sight tape is going to look. So you can get your max range. So if you want to range out to 140 yards, you can do that, or even 100. It just depends on what you want for your sight tape. I'm going to leave mine at 130. Orientation, top to bottom, which is typically what you want. Number range, you want it in those 10-yard increments with the individual lines in between for the yardage. Your line width, your font size. You can play with all these things to get a sight tape that's very custom for you. Even the line color. So if you want your 1-yard marks to be a different color, you can do that, and you can make them different than your 10-yard marks. And you can also pick out colors that are more easily to see for you in the field. So after you've kind of taken a look at your shaft selector, seen what it looks like, you're going to jump down here to the sight in option. And this is where you're going to put the information that you collected at the range. So you can see range 1, which is 20 yards, which is where I sighted in my top pin at, and you can take your range 2, and that's the second distance that you sighted in at. So you can input whatever you want. So for me, I could put 60 yards, and in this box right here under mark 2, I could enter the distance in inches measured with my calipers between my top mark and my second mark. So that would be the distance between my 20-yard pin and my 60-yard pin. And then I can hit calculate speed, and it's going to calculate a speed for my arrow, and that's going to go into my sight tape. I would say the further you can get this range, the more accurate your sight tape's going to be. So for example, if I sighted in my bow at 20 yards and I use my floater pin, my bottom 60-yard pin, and I move that whole sight down and I sighted that pin at 100, I could then take the distance of my 20 to 60-yard pin, and I could add that from add that to the distance from my 60 to my 100-yard mark, which I made on my blank sight tape. I can add those together, and then I can input that number here in this mark 2. So like I said, the further distance you can get, the more accurate your tape's going to be. But Essentially what I'm saying is you're going to need a distance between a first mark and a second mark, and you're going to input that in inches here in this Mark II box, and then you're going to hit calculate speed. So when you hit print, it's going to generate sight tapes for your setup. And you can see that it's going to print 6 sight tapes. So you've got 2 in the middle here that are the exact same size or same speed. And then you've got some outliers on either side. So you've got a few feet per second slower, a few feet per second faster. And what you're going to want to do is to take those and then put them on your bow and then go out and test it. You know, shoot to 110 yards if you can, or 100 yards, and just verify your sight tape. You may find that you might be a feet per second slower or a feet per second faster, but with this program you're actually going to get a pretty dang good sight tape. And from my experience, the generated sight tapes that kind of sit right there in the middle are right in the wheelhouse and have been very accurate for me. So that's kind of the process, 3 different ways. You know, you can use a simple process like the calipers and just your 20 to 60 yard pin, or you can use the paper method here and make those little marks with your pins, you know, 20 through 60, and line those marks up with the sight tapes that were provided with your sight. You can shoot your bow through a chronographer and line that up with the feet per second marks if your sight tapes that you got with your sight came with that. In most cases, a lot of cases they don't, so you may have to do a method like the calipers or the piece of paper. Or, like I just showed you, you know, you can use this Archer's Advantage software and you can generate a very accurate sight tape for your setup with all those different inputs that go into it. And I think, you know, this is my preferred method, and it's only 12 bucks. Like I said, I think it's worth it annually just to be able to develop sight tapes and then also be able to select an arrow that's going to be the best spine and the best setup for you. Cut out a sight tape and apply it to your sight. You can see I've printed one off here. I used a set of scissors, or you can use an X-Acto knife. You just cut that out. You can see here you've got your yardage mark. So if you're shooting a single pin sight, you would cut this out and apply it and put the indicator mark here at the 20, and you're going to slide that down as you go. If you're shooting a multi-pin sight like I do, I use my bottom pin as my floater. So what I like to do is cut the tape right there above the 60 yard mark slightly. I put the indicator on the 60, and that's my default. I know that my pins are sighted in 20 through 60, and then I'm going to use my bottom pin as I slide this down to the individual marks to shoot out to extended yardage. The next step is to actually apply the tape. What I like to do is take an arrow wrap. I've got a piece of gaffer's tape, but you'll get the idea. If you take a white arrow wrap, you're just going to lay your sight tape on it. What I like to do is take some arrow glue, some fletching glue, and just make a couple of dabs and then apply a nice layer with a Q-tip over the sight tape there. And that's going to create a barrier. Glue that down to the arrow wrap. It's going to give it some weather protection. After that, I like to take a piece of masking or packing tape, clear packing tape, put that over the top, cut it out, and at that point I can peel off that arrow wrap and I can actually apply it to my sight. And again, like I said, that 60 yard mark, I'm going to put the indicator right there, and I've got a perfect sight tape for my setup, good all the way out to 130 yards. Okay, so that's how you generate a custom sight tape for your bow. If you've got questions about any of this process, it's pretty extensive, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. Just drop them in the comments below. We'd be happy to answer those. Also, we would love it if you would smash that subscribe button. We need to get to that 100,000 subscribers. So get your sight tapes put together, go to a TAC event, get ready for the fall. It's time to go.